Okay, can you hear me? We have sound? Hey, look at that. Right, so I've got a slightly interesting challenge, which is now I'm going to have to find the slides, which I had all set up on the other system. Andrea, Angie, you can both hear me. Angie, can you hear me okay? And I can't see who else has just joined us. Hannah, I'm hoping you can hear us. And Pallavi, can you hear me as well? Apologies for that. Absolute annoying. Having tested that several times this week and everything was working fine, and all of a sudden, no, there we go. Right, we seem to be able to hear each other. Good. Right, let's crack on, shall we? Give me 2 moments, just as I will crack straight on. We'll still run this to time, and I will find these slides for you as we do this. Now, you should still be able to hear me. I'm just going to find the slides as we talk. So, this is the Ask Great Questions to Build Rapport Faster webinar. Always good to be able to do these sorts of things on the fly and not at all remotely stressful. In fact, I was just explaining this is a new system, and being a new system, I was all quite confident, having tested it several times this week and had no issues with it whatsoever. And then fantastically, we go live and it doesn't work. But there we go. These things, as they say, are sent to test us. Right, now I think I'm almost ready to put some slides up for you, which will be rather good, wouldn't it? And if we go to this, application, and there we go. Now, I'm thinking you can see those slides, and I'm thinking that you can hear me. If that's the case, that'd be good. I'm just going to start talking for a little while and make sure that we're not stuck on anything else. But I believe now that we ought to be in a situation where you can hear what I'm saying and you can see on the screen some words that are talking about coaching, interviews, training, one-to-ones, and group discussion. So I'm just going to flip back to this, and I'm hoping now that that is all working beautifully. There are 5 of you still here, so thank you for your standing by. Right, can you all just give me a quick yes if you've been able to see that slide that said where will this help you, coaching, interviews, training, and if you can hear me. Could you all just give me a quick yes, please? I'd appreciate that very much. Thank you, Ange. Thank you, Pallavi. Thank you. Great. Thank you, Angie. Really pleased to hear that. Right, then, having spent a silly amount of time just trying to sort that, we're going to crack on at proper pace. So, where's this going to help you? It is going to help you in a variety of different areas. Now, I have said clearly that if you have some questions to ask, I'd encourage you to ask them. As you've probably noticed, I've just had to switch the system. So right now, I can't as easily see when you flag up a question. So every now and again, I will go and check to see whether there are any questions. So if there's a bit of a delay, then I'm sorry if I don't get to it immediately. But there will be some time at the end of this webinar still. I've allowed about 45 minutes for this webinar, which will allow us to answer any questions at the end. So this webinar is all about how we can look at both questions and rapport and where we can use these. So here are some situations that I know they work really, really well. I know a number of you are looking at coaching training at the moment, certainly in interviews and training, in one-to-ones, group discussions. And I need to be able to tell you exactly how I know what I'm going to tell you absolutely works. See, the majority of the work I do, I certainly teach coaching, I certainly teach interviewing, all these other areas. But the majority of the work I do, and what I've been doing for close on 20 years now, is often standing in front of a room full of people and asking questions. And if you know anything about training, if you've ever come across the kind of work that some people do in their training, there's always a certain amount of stress and pressure. People always worry about what if I don't get any answers? What if people don't say anything? What if nobody wants to answer? And the reality is that, there we go, the reality is that actually it's a really good idea to be able to say to people, right, I'm going to ask a question and I know that I'm going to get an answer. So the kind of techniques I'm going to share with you today, the kind of skills I'm going to show you, absolutely 100% work. And what I mean by that is at 6:30 in the morning, if I'm facing a room full of shift workers, 70 or 80 shift workers who are sat like that, it takes a certain bit of nerve to know that when you ask a question, you're going to get an answer. And I'm going to show you exactly the questions and the techniques I use in order to do that. And I'm also going to show you and share with you the exact process that I use that allows me to get a good response in terms of rapport. Because there's a really simple proposition here. And the proposition is this: the better rapport you've got with somebody, and if you're not certain what I mean by rapport, we will talk more about that in a moment, but the better rapport that you have with somebody, the better questions you can ask. But likewise, it works the other way around too, because the more better questions you ask, or the better quality questions you ask, the better sense of rapport that you'll manage to create with the other person. Now, if you stop to think about this even for a moment, certainly in a coaching situation, this is really, really important. Because in a coaching situation, as you'll know, you sometimes find yourself discussing some really in-depth, important to the coachee situations. It can be personal, it can be professional, it can be a range of different areas, but the coachee can sometimes really open up. And as you'll know, a good coach sometimes is really going to challenge and ask some very difficult, very pertinent, sometimes very personal, challenging points. And if that's going to happen, then a certain degree of rapport is going to help. Now, if you look back to somebody like Dale Carnegie, writing 100 or so years ago, he made a very obvious point, a very clear point, a very important point, which was most people love talking about themselves. And he tells a story about being sat next to a lady at a dinner, and he said at the end of the evening, she turned to him and said, "You were a wonderful conversationist. Thank you so much. I found you so interesting." Dale Carnegie shares that, in fact, that particular evening, the only one who'd been speaking was this woman, because he knew nothing about her topic of conversation, which was bridge. So he literally just listened to her, and she found him fascinating and brilliant and really enjoyed talking to him. And at the nub of all of this is, if we're going to ask good quality questions, we then need to listen to the answer. And we also need to be aware of how and where we can use rapport in order to start to get better responses and better answers. So since we're talking about rapport, I have 4 questions for you. This is an opportunity for you to please type some answers. What is rapport? How do we get rapport? What happens if we haven't got it? And what happens if we've got it? And what happens if we don't have it? So those are my 4 questions for you. I'm going to invite you, please, to type your answers or your thoughts or your suggestions to what those answers could be. So, what is rapport? How do we get it? What happens if we have it? And what happens if we don't have it? So, I've seen a few webinars recently, and there's an awful lot of reading slides. I don't want to do that. So, please now just take the moment, just give me a couple of ideas in terms of what is rapport, how do we get it, what happens if we've got it, what happens if we haven't. Take a moment, please, to type in some answers. Okay, so on the basis that nobody appears to want to suggest any answers, We go. I beg your pardon. We've got some great ones. Right. Pallavi, thank you. Rapport is being comfortable with someone whom you can approach and talk to easily. You get it by building trust. If you have a rapport, it's easier to manage relationships. I'll come to your answer in a moment, Ange. Pallavi, I think it's a really good answer. Thank you. Now, it's important we look at this because people talk about building rapport. People talk about what happens when we don't have it, when we do have it. But the point I'm about to make, which is why Pallavi's answer there is so important, we need to build trust. Somebody we can approach, someone we can talk with easily. These are really, really important points. But the point is, of course, it's not always difficult to do that. It's not always easy to do that. And I talked about a training situation. Now, when you're faced with that room full of people I spoke about, sometimes getting some rapport is kind of difficult because they don't want to be there. They don't want to talk to you. They don't want to work with you. You might have a similar situation if you're managing somebody, if you're giving them some review of their work. You certainly have a situation in terms of coaching. It's difficult to always have rapport. Ange has written, rapport is realizing that people like people who are like them. Lovely. Getting rapport is working out a commonality. Is that a word? It is now, Ange. It's definitely a word. Commonality is a word. And using it to communicate better. If you don't have it, you never get past the polite. I'd agree with all of that too. I'll come to you in a moment, Angie. So, yeah, a commonality, finding people who like people. I think it was Billy Connolly who said, like most people, I find myself infinitely fascinating. Now, aside from the fact that's quite funny, it does also suggest that if we can find something with the other person or the audience, with our coachee, with our colleague that we're managing, something, then we might be able to get a bit of an edge on our asking questions. And likewise, asking good quality questions will give us an edge on rapport. So Angie, you've written a good understanding of each other and find a common ground. Again, thank you. I'd absolutely agree with that. So thank you for those three suggestions, those three ideas. Thank you for playing. I would agree with all of those. I think they're really, really good. And I absolutely agree that rapport is this idea of when there's something that common ground, something we like about each other, something we trust, something we agree. Now, all of that's brilliant in an ideal situation. But it's not always an ideal situation, is it? See, sometimes you're going to be coaching somebody that you have nothing in common with. And it's great if we can pick the person we're going to coach, but we can't always do that. It's not always possible to be able to decide exactly the audience that we're working with. It's not always a perfect situation where we can make things work the way we want to work. So what we're going to have to do at some point is to create some rapport. Now, whenever I talk about creating rapport, there's always somebody who says this sounds manipulative. And there's a couple of ways I could answer this. But if we put those to one side, because this is a webinar, we have to get to the point, there is an element of this that is a bit manipulative. You see, rapport happens, and you see it happen all over the place quite naturally. So those examples that you've just written, I'd agree with those, spot on, exactly right. But you can see rapport happening. You've talked about some things there, thank you for those, where you know rapport is happening, but you can see it happening in other people. And there are four words often come up when people talk about rapport, and these are matching, mirroring, pacing, and leading. You've probably come across these words before. They're talked about a lot in neuro-linguistic programming, they're talked about in coaching, they're talked about in all sorts of communication programs. But let's look at what they actually mean. So, if you think to a time when you are working with somebody or you're socializing with somebody that you would suggest you have rapport with. Now, for some people, that will be a significant other, a partner, a husband or a wife. And for others, it absolutely won't be them. Sometimes it'll be somebody you work with that you just like. You know when you have that situation where you can sit down and you can just get work done. And there are other times when it just doesn't seem to gel with a different person. So the example I often give is perhaps in a bar or a pub. It could be a restaurant, it could be the dining room where you work, It could be whether 2 or 3 people are gathered together, and you'll notice there are certain types of things that happen in how they look, how they speak, how they gesture. So matching and mirroring is exactly as it sounds. If you can imagine 2 people talking to each other, and the example again I might refer to is perhaps a couple of people having a coffee, and you'll see them almost getting to the point where they lift their coffees together, whereas one person is finishing, the other person will go, yes, exactly, that's what I think, and the conversation just sort of flows. And whenever you've been in good rapport with somebody, and you can think of people right now, good friends, colleagues, people you have a good personal relationship with, you know that movement, tone, language, all these things start to happen naturally. But if we're looking at creating rapport, then we're starting with somebody with whom we don't have that level of trust, the commonality, Ange, that word you just may have made up, that common ground, the getting past the polite that you all referred to. So we have to somehow create that rapport. And what that often means is matching and mirroring the other person. So in its simplest form, it might mean being sensitive to the fact that I'm quite a gestural person. But if I'm talking to somebody who's like this, and by the way, arms folded isn't necessarily a bad thing. Might just be how they are, they're comfortable. But it might mean that I might want to just tone down my gestures a little bit. It might mean that I have a client who uses the word landed when he talks about training. How did the training land? Did you land? I think we landed that really well. I hadn't come across this phrase before, but it's a word he uses a lot. You see this all the time, corporate jargon that gets spun around, it spreads out throughout the office. Now, if I'm talking to somebody else who uses that jargon, and I just use a little bit of that jargon myself, the reality is that person's going to understand me better. It makes more sense to them what it is that I'm saying. I'm using their word, I'm borrowing their language. And what we start to see in natural rapport is that both people are kind of following each other. But if I'm going to create this artificially, if I'm going to start to sit with you and start to move like you, talk like you, use the language you're using, at some point I need to see whether or not I can lead it. Because if you think about this, rapport is when you're both often unconsciously doing the same sorts of things, moving, talking in the same way. If this is going to happen artificially, I need to take some of your lead. But for this to really work, if I do something different, you ought to follow me. So what might happen is after 20, 30 seconds, this happens very quickly, I get the sense that we are starting to go into rapport. And if we are, then what I might do is just to slightly move the pace on a little bit, because I want to now lead you. I want to get you to follow me. Now, I'm hoping so far that all makes sense. I'm just going to check for any questions. No questions. Fantastic. We'll crack on. There is opportunity for questions towards the end. But let's look at some of the things that we can follow and that we can pace and we can lead on. So I've mentioned words, I've mentioned tone. Body language is the obvious one that people always go for. So often when you work with people who have just done some NLP or just started to look at coaching, you'll see them trying to literally copy the person opposite them as the person opposite moves. This becomes very obvious very quickly. And what you're actually doing is taking the mickey out of them. You're having a joke at their expense, whether or not you mean to. It's an obvious thing. So if I'm kind of telling you reasons why we can't do this, and I'm really quite animated about it, and I'm quite passionate about it, I'm quite angry about it, there's no point you being angry back at me, because that's just going to end up in a fight. But what you need to perhaps do as you start to speak is you might agree with certain things. You might understand my point. That doesn't mean you have to agree with me. And you certainly don't get angry. As I've said there, you're matching and mirroring the passion, but not the emotion. Let me give you an example. So I'll take this example from my situation. And if it doesn't entirely match your situation, I'm hoping it will still make sense, and maybe you can apply it to your situation. So I don't know if you've ever been out for a drink. Maybe you've stayed a bit too late. You've had a drink, you've had a second drink, you've had a third drink, and before you know where you are, it's time for a taxi back. And as you walk up the drive, you hear plates being put away in the kitchen with extreme prejudice like that. And you walk in, and I'm a middle-aged man, so I might ask the question, stupidly, how are you? And the answer I'll often get, if I were to do something like that, would be, fine. And that single one word, one syllable answer tells me that I'm in a bit of trouble. Now, sensibly, of course, what I should do at that point is to go to bed fairly quickly. But of course, in that situation, what I might be doing in this example would be to prove that I was not drunk. So what I might do is then go, so how was your day? In other words, all nice and slow and relaxed. And the answer might come back, how was my day? I'll tell you how my day was actually dog breath. My day was this, and then this happened, and then this thing happened, and the delivery was late, and then the thing blew up, and then the boiler broke, and then the toilet started flooding, and then the cat was sick in my handbag. That's how my day was. How was your day? In other words, there is a rather lack of rapport. And if I were to start matching and mirroring that, it's going to go badly wrong. But what I might start to do is to pick up the pace of the way that I'm being spoken to and think, right, well, let's get this sorted. I'm really sorry about this. I'm going to go and do this and help you out now. We're not looking to copy or mimic the other person. But we're trying to match and mirror the pace, the tone. Eye contact's an interesting one. People often think, if they start to think about matching and mirroring, they have to make really good eye contact with the other person. Well, eye contact works if they're making eye contact with you. But not everybody makes good eye contact. See, some people prefer to look at their feet. So if you're trying to coach somebody, well, let's take a management situation. And I've seen this happen many, many times in training courses we've run. If you're trying to manage somebody who is staring at their feet, folding their arms and muttering to themselves about how unhappy they are that you have decided that they can't do what they want to do, or they're not happy that they've been told off for being late, or whatever the situation is. I've seen managers actually lower their eyes and try and get eye contact with the other person. Do you want to look up here? This sort of thing. Now, when you describe it like that, it's clearly not right. So if building rapport is correct, and it is, what we might want to suggest instead is, okay, I'm not going to try and stare at them. In fact, I'm going to look at my feet. And I'm going to kind of ask questions the same sort of way. I'm not going to take the mickey out of them. I'm not copying them. But I'm noticing that this is how they talk, and this is the passion, really, that they're bringing to why they're not happy about being told off. And I'm going to talk to them in a similar way. What I'm going to attempt to do is to pace the way this is working and lead them out of it. I'll talk about that and how we do that in a moment. Just one other thing I've mentioned there is breathing. Now, the ultimate thing that we can match and mirror is breathing rate. Now, if you think of your most intimate moments, perhaps with a child, you're sat there cuddling, reading a story, watching a film together, with a partner, with a loved one, you're just sat there talking, drinking a cup of coffee in the evening, really quiet, relaxed, lovely moments. You might notice you're breathing at the same time. So what we could do, if we really like the idea of this rapport thing, is to start to match our breathing rate with that of the person we're talking to. It's a lot easier than it sounds. You just need to track their breathing. So quick tip, if you want to see their breathing, look at their shoulders. Don't look anywhere else. If you look anywhere else, it will go wrong. Look at their shoulders. And when you look at their shoulders, you can start to match their breathing. Remember, none of this has to be exact same time. It's just an approximation. So if somebody is a very gestural person, as I said, you just occasionally use a similar gesture when you're speaking. You're not trying to exact the same time as them. you're going to use an approximation to the sort of language they're using. I've referenced tone there. You don't have to, you're not doing an impression of them, is what I'm saying here. And I talked about pacing and leading. So if we are in rapport with somebody, how do we test it? And of course, we test it quite simply by, if I've been following you, matching and mirroring, you ought to start following me. So the first time I ever tried this, tried with a guy called Neil. We were in an airport somewhere. Neil is one of those guys who kind of stands like this a lot, does a big kind of macho rugby laugh. And one of the things that Neil would never do is that. So I kind of stood alongside him with my hands on my hips. Neil has a habit of not looking at you straight on. He tends to do that, look down at you. Quite a weird thing, but this is what he does. So although I felt awkward to start with, I started doing the same thing. Yes, Neil, we shall talk like this. And after about 20 to 30 seconds, I thought, I wonder if this is working now. So I just kind of did this. A moment later, his hand came up and did that, which suggested to me we were starting to go into rapport. So come back to the question earlier, is this manipulative? Yeah, it is manipulative. But I'm assuming that we are going to, I've got a couple of questions come up here. This could be manipulative, but we are, of course, using this in a positive way. We're looking to get better responses from our other person. I'm going to move on to questions in just a moment, but I can see Pallavi has asked a question. Pallavi, one of the challenges we face is we are expected to solve problems and often get blank stares. How do you suggest we break through this? That's a really good question. Thank you, Pallavi. So let me ask you a question, if I may. You're expected to solve problems. Often we get blank stares. So are you asking the question, Pallavi, or are you expected to give the answer? If I could ask that first, please. And then we'll start looking at some questions. It's possible that some of the ways that you ask questions might help. Actually, Pallavi, asking the question, but you get blank faces. Yeah, okay. I'm going to show you something about asking questions that I can't guarantee will get you answers, but I can tell you, I often have to face large numbers of people. And the question I get asked more than ever is, how do you know when you ask questions, your audience is going to join in? Because you've kind of seen this happen before, I'm sure, where people stand in front of a room full of people and go, so, are there any questions? What you then get, Pallavi, is not a blank face or blank faces. You get 300 or 400 or 500 blank faces who sit back and go, no questions, jog on, don't really want to get involved in this. So what I'm going to show you right now is some ways you can pretty much guarantee you're going to get some answers. Does that sound like what you need to hear, Pallavi? Good stuff. You can tell from the faces they want to say something. Yeah, Angie, I think that's a good point. I'm going to show you a little bit about open and closed questions. I'm going to show you a little bit about why questions work. And I'm going to show you the simplest thing you can do to get more responses. All right, so I'm just going to switch back to the slides. I'm sorry I can't see both at the same time, but hey, at least we can get this now. So open questions, closed questions. Now, I know, absolutely know that you know the differences between these. Open questions, how, what, where, when, who, and why. Closed questions, there's some examples there. Do you, have you, are you, will you, can you, did you? Goes on forever. Now, very, very simply, closed questions can be answered yes or no. Open questions, I appreciate things like when and who are shorter, but open questions can't or shouldn't be able to be answered yes or no. The majority of people who have trouble with getting a response, and Pallavi, this might be your situation, I'm not saying it is yet, but we'll see how we go with this. The majority of people who have trouble with getting responses to questions ask too many closed questions. Now, there's a reason for this. If you are a famous person and you're on television, you can pretty much be asked anything at all. It doesn't matter how rubbish the question is. It doesn't matter if Jonathan Ross, I think he's great on TV. I think he's very entertaining, but he is a terrible interviewer. But it doesn't matter because the famous people on his show largely have a movie to talk about, or some music, or a new TV show, or a product, or something. Well, the people that we're working with have no such desire necessarily to talk to us. So if you ask closed questions, do you want to tell me a bit more about that? They may well want to. But the problem is that closed questions are too easy to ignore. So I'll take you back to that example of a large room full of people. If I, as a speaker, say, so, do you have any questions? I know from doing this for about 20 years now, I get a much lower hit rate of questions than if I say, what questions have you got? The open question, if you use them consistently, all the time, whenever possible, will give you a much better hit rate of responses. And I'll show you why that is in a moment. Now, would, could, and should, they all sound like the start to an open question, but they're not. They're closed questions. Would you, could you, should you? If the second word of the question you're about to ask is you, there's a very good chance it's a closed question. Would you like to tell me about blah, 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 blah? Can you do this, that, and the other? The difficulty is that it feels like it's more polite. Do you want to tell me? Would you mind telling me a little bit about this? It sounds more polite, but actually this is where we go back to rapport and questions. If I'm going to build rapport with you, I'm going to be polite to you. I'm going to try and find some ways in which we have that commonality, that shared grounds, that shared view, that trust. I'm going to try and find all those things. I'm going to ask you those questions, though, that are going to be open. So, do you have any questions? Is a closed question. What questions have you got? Assumes you've got questions. And we'll talk about why that's so important in just a moment. If you ever find yourself walking through a part of town and you don't have a watch with you and mysteriously you don't have a phone with you, everyone's got a phone these days, but if you don't have the ability to know what time it is, but you want to know, this is pretty much what you're going to do. First thing you're going to do is to look around to see if you can see a clock anywhere, because chances are you don't really want to interact with anybody unless you have to. Now, assuming you can't see a clock, you're then likely to look for somebody who's wearing a watch, who looks clean and sane and safe. And then you're likely to walk up to them and say, excuse me, have you got the time, please? This is a closed question. They could, of course, go yes and walk off. They're unlikely to. But the open version of that same question is, excuse me, what time is it? Now, it's no big deal with asking for what time it is, or how do I get to the health centre, please, rather than do you know the way to the health centre? But what I want to show you is that nearly all of us ask nearly closed questions nearly all of the time. And the balance between rapport and better questions happens with far more open questions far more of the time. Now, you'll notice there is a little red circle around the word why. And I'm curious. In fact, I've been talking a little while. Time, I think, for you to type something or write something. Why? Oh, that's good. Pallavi, I'm going to pick up your comment there in a moment. Why is there a little red circle around the word why, would you suggest? Just while you're thinking about that, Pallavi said that's spot on, Graham. Thanks a lot. Absolute pleasure, Pallavi. On reflection, that's exactly what I do most of the time. What to, followed by you. Yeah, that's what most people do, Pallavi. So I've just asked you all the question. Why is there a red line around the word why? And this is an important one, by the way. Why have I put a red circle around the question why? Because why is the ultimate open question, right? If you've more recently joined us, hello, welcome. I can see there's a few more people arrived, so thank you for that. I'm still wanting to know why I put a red circle. Is it because it gives a chance for a more open dialogue? It can do, Pallavi, but actually not always. I give one other person the opportunity here to have an answer. Look, you've been to a few webinars, right, where you just look at slides. And I appreciate sometimes that's easy. It's the end of a long day. You're tired. You've been working. It's Friday tomorrow. But come on, let's engage the brain a little bit. Besides, I can't do a webinar about questions without asking a few questions, right? You get that. So just a few more moments, please. Why is there a red circle around the word why? It could be because it gives a chance for a more open dialogue, but actually not always. So, oh, there we go. At a guess. Why indicates it's going to be a question. That's good. And is it potentially negative? Little kids like why? Okay. Thank you for playing both Angie and Ange. So here's the reason. If somebody that works for me hasn't done what they're supposed to do, and we sit down and they go, right, I asked you to do this on Monday. Why didn't you do it? However nicely I ask that, however charming I am, and I am very charming, the problem with that question, why didn't you do it, is you're then going to get the story about why you didn't do it. So what I've actually found that it's slightly less judgmental when you ask it. I'm not saying, by the way, why is not a good question to ask. It's very powerful, and Pallavi, you make a good point there. It does give a chance for more open dialogue, and Angie, yes, it absolutely signals this is a question. But I think the real potential problem with why is that it puts people often on the back foot. So rather than why didn't you do this on Monday, what I might say is, you remember when we spoke about this on Monday, you were keen to get on with this. I'm just curious, what was it that happened that stopped you from doing it? Or tell me a little bit more about what happened, or when you realized that you weren't going to have the opportunity to get this finished, what choices did you make then? In other words, I'm trying to find a little bit more rather than just why didn't you do it? Why didn't you do it in that example tends to just give us really a little bit of negativity. So the phrase I nearly always come back to is tell me. Tell me a bit about this. Tell me a bit about that. That's interesting. Tell me some more about it. Tell me what you're going to do next. Now you'll notice tell me isn't even a question. In fact, it's massively powerful. And what it allows the brain to do is what's called a transderivational search. There's a phrase for this time of the night. Now, you don't need to know it's called a transderivational search, but it would be cool if you did know it, wouldn't it? Be a good, cool coaching thing to know about. You see, the questions that you're going to ask that are open force the brain, your brain, my brain, anybody's brain, to perform a transderivational search. In other words, they have to go inside to make sense of what you just said. Let me explain. If I say to a room full of people, do you have any questions? And Pallavi, your blank faces example here. Do you have this? Did you do that? The answer in the brain quite quickly is, well, no. However, if I say to a room full of people, what questions have you got? Now just consider this for a moment. And it happens so fast, people just don't notice. When I say to you, what questions have you got? There's an inbuilt assumption. And the inbuilt assumption is that you have a question. So when I say to you, what questions have you got? For you to understand the question, you have to go, oh man, I'm supposed to have a question. What question? There's supposed to be a question. Because the sentence doesn't make sense unless your brain agrees with me that you have a question. So when I ask that question, what questions have you got, to a room full of people, I get a far better hit rate than, do you have any questions? My follow-up to that question is always, what else? And I can use what else with my main question repeatedly. Tell me what you think about my suggestions. I could say, what do you think about my suggestions? That's okay. Do you like my suggestions? But tell me what you think about my suggestions. I'm assuming that you've already had a thought about them. Now, what this does, Pallavi, I reference you because you talked about the blank faces, is I'm assuming that you're already thinking something about my suggestion. Now, by the way, if you're not, you're not. Or if you've got no questions, you've got no questions. But statistically, I get a far better hit rate by doing this. What questions have you got? First question, what else? The assumption is there's another thing. And I can start to then lead this series of questions the way I want it to go. So tell me what is worrying you about whatever it is we've been talking about. Tell me what you're most positive about. Tell me how we can make this happen in reality. In other words, I can start to direct what's happening and where this is going. And the key to all of this with questions is about making positive assumptions before you ask the question. Now, positive assumption doesn't mean where everything's going to be yes and great and fantastic, but it's making a positive assumption about the discussion, the outcome, about the other person. So we can look at some of these examples here, right? What have you tried so far? Second question down. That is one of my favorite all-time questions. And if you're familiar with TGRO, coaching model, and I know some of you are, I love that for checking reality. Just take a moment to think about it. So somebody comes to tell you, well, I want to be more confident and I've got to put myself forward for more webinars. I've got to put myself forward for some personal development. I've got to try and get promoted. All these things I want to do. And they're telling you why it's a great idea. So what have you tried so far? If you think about that, there's a number of interesting outcomes. For a start, I'm giving them the gift of believing them that they've tried something so far, even if I know they haven't. It allows them to think for themselves and audit what they have tried. And I can tell you that when they ask that question, very often they've tried nothing so far. Or they'll tell you, well, I tried this that time once, 3 months ago, didn't work so well, didn't do it again, that was about it. So what have you tried so far is massively useful. In the middle of the TGRO, it allows people to realize that actually the problem they're talking about isn't the problem they think they've got. You can see some other questions then. You can see the fact that they are all making assumptions, positive assumptions. How will this affect everyone on your team? So now they're thinking away from themselves about other people. We're assuming there will be effects on other people. And we allow the delegates or the client or the coachee to decide for themselves whether affect means positively or negatively. But we are making a positive assumption that there is going to be an effect. I really like these questions. What will be the first signs that this is going how you want? That's the second from last. And then the last question, how will you feel when you get your first yes? What we're doing, if you're familiar with neuro-linguistic programming here, is we are future pacing. So think forward to the time when you've already done this thing that we're coaching them on. And when you get that thing and you've got them to say a yes, how's that going to affect you? And what it starts to do in a coaching perspective is allow people to get some pressure up, some excitement up about getting more yeses from this and taking a bit more effort. Angie Clayton, a very useful tip. Thank you, Angie. That's very nice of you. Thank you. Just checking those questions there. Good. So these questions here that I'm sharing with you now, these are just examples of some good quality open questions. But whenever I start talking about open questions, there's always a point when somebody will say, well, these are good questions, but you've had time to think about them. And I'll show you exactly how to do all that in a moment. So a bear walks into a pub. And just in case you were snoozing slightly there, I'm going to say that again. A bear walks into a pub. The landlord comes over and says, yes, mate, what can I get you? The bear says, I would like a pint of beer, please. And the landlord says, why the big pause? Yeah, you'll be using that one later on. The problem with questions, when I start to talk about questions, is people always say, I can't think of the good question quick enough. You don't need to. The reason you don't need to is you're going to be able to use the same questions over and over and over again. And I can tell you for a fact, people don't notice. They absolutely don't notice, because think right back to the start of this webinar, most people are largely consumed with themselves and their own problems and their own worlds, and being coached on whatever you're coaching them on or talking to them about or training them on. And so the questions I most often use in a training session, so I use what questions have you got? I've got a slightly better version, which is what questions, comments, or observations have you got? That's a better question. And you might want to think for a moment as to why it's a better question. And as you're thinking about that, allow me to elucidate. What questions, comments, or observations have you got? It's making an assumption you've got a question or a comment or an observation. And if you know about learning styles, you'll be aware that comment you often hear and observation you often see. So some people will pick up an observation more than comment. Some people will think I've got a question and miss out the comment and observation bit. That's just a phrase I use a lot. What questions, comments, observations have you got? And then pretty much, whatever we're talking about, whether it's coaching, whether it's training, leadership, meetings, briefings, presentation skills, whatever we happen to be talking about in that particular training session, my question is nearly always, tell me, and then whatever the question's about. And it will be a version of some of the questions we just looked at. Tell me what you've tried so far. Tell me how this is going to affect everyone on your team. Tell me what you're going to do when other people resist this. Tell me what support you need from me. What support you need from me, by the way, brilliant coaching question. It gets all the sorts of problems out that they need to get out, and it makes you look like a lovely person that you truly are. So I tend to use those questions. Tell me, tell me. I'm interested, tell me. I'm curious, tell me. But it's the same question. And then I nearly always follow up with what else, what else, what else. As a coach, you can do this. Tell me what options you've got. I don't know, I've got this option. Great, that's a great option. What else? Well, I could do this. What else? Well, I don't know, I'm running out of ideas. Well, I suppose I could do this. Yeah, it's a good option. What else? And that's all it's going to be. And I've said there the 7-second pause. Hence the big pause joke, just in case that went over your head. When the other person finishes speaking, and this is true of an audience, this is true of a meeting, Pallavi, this is true if you're talking to 1 or 2 people and you get the blank faces, this is true if you're talking to a conference of 500 people, this is true if you're coaching somebody. When they finish speaking, don't say anything for 7 seconds. That's it. Now you can do that. You can start doing that at your very next coaching session, meeting, or briefing. Don't say anything for 7 seconds. And for those 7 seconds, don't sit there like this looking at your watch. That will freak them out. But take a note. Continue to be interested. If you're in a meeting room, look at people smiling and nodding. And a few things will happen in those 7 seconds. The first thing is you are thinking about what your next most relevant question is going to be, making a positive assumption and asking the relevant question to steer it the way it needs to go. It will often calm people down, because if you're in a coaching situation particularly, you're getting to some quite detailed content. So it allows people just to breathe, to have that moment of, yeah, that is what I want to say next. It allows you to ensure you're going to ask an open question. And best of all, what happens in that 7 seconds is that the other person will often start talking again. So massively powerful. The 7-second pause, you don't even need any content. So we're almost at that point when we're going to finish this webinar. I'm going to look at your questions in just a moment, any final further questions you might have. What question can I ask someone I believe is not willing to take any action? That's a brilliant question. Pallavi, let me come to that in just a moment, if I may, because I'm going to give you some homework right now. And really simple bits of homework here. First of all, I want you to find 3 questions that you really like, all right? And then use them a lot. Now, when I do presentation skills, I often point out that I only ask the same 2 or 3 questions, namely, what questions have you got, and what else? People don't seem to notice that. So find 2 or 3 questions you like. I want you to start looking at when you notice other people are going in and out of rapport. Anywhere you go where there are people, just notice those who are in rapport and out of rapport. Just make a mental note of it. The third thing I'd like you to try is to experiment yourself with going in and out of rapport with other people. Because here's an interesting point. Everyone talks about going into rapport. Sometimes you have to go out of rapport with somebody. So sometimes if your direct report has let you down or has acted in an inappropriate way, stepping out of rapport will tell them on a multitude of levels that this is not something that they should be doing. And it sends a really clear, frankly, subliminal message and allows you to move things on. No, we're not going to be doing that. This is how we're going to be doing it from now on. And you can always pick up rapport after that. So those are the 3 bits of homework, which if you're fully dedicated to this webinar, I know you are because you've been sat here for best part of an hour, so we've participated in this, so thank you for that. It would be great to get as much out of it as you possibly can. You're not going to be surprised to know that my last question is, what are your comments and questions and observations? So I can see that Pallavi has a question there, and I see Deborah has one as well. So Pallavi, what questions can I ask someone I believe is not willing to take any action? So I have a couple of possible answers for this, and you may or may not like these, but I will tell you exactly what they are. The first is this: if you are coaching somebody, my starting point has to be that they want to be coached. And if they want to be coached, my follow-on starting point has to be that they're then willing to take action. Because if they're not willing to take action, what's the point of them being coached? So I might come to the point where I'm trying to find out from you if you want to do this. If you don't want to do this, that's fine. But I can't force you to be coached any more than I can force you to take part in a conference, any more than I can force you to join in on a training session or anything at all. I can do the very best I can. I can try to engage you. I can try to ask you good questions. But if you don't join in for whatever reasons, then you don't join in. So what questions can I ask someone I believe is not willing to take any action? So I might be thinking in terms of, let's assume they're telling me they want to join in. So I'm curious, Pallavi, what would stop you from taking action? Pallavi, what support do you need from me in order for you to do this thing we've been talking about? The question I asked you earlier on, really strong question. What have you already tried? Now, when you do T-Grow, you'll often find that people are desperate to get onto options because that's the bit that feels like real coaching. But I'll often say to people, it could take you 45 minutes, an hour longer, just to go back through what's the problem, what's the goal, what's the reality. It's the reality that people often find that the question they've been talking about is not the real question. I hope that helps. Please say if so. Deborah, what are your suggestions for managing a tearful individual? Right. So I don't know, Deborah, if we're talking about a coaching situation or a manager. I assume if we're talking managing a tearful individual. Strangely enough, we were talking about this just 2 days ago at a conference I was speaking at. And one of many managers' big fears is a tearful individual. So I often hear people say to me, I don't mind if they're sarcastic or angry. I don't mind if they sit with their arms folded. I don't mind if they glare at me, but I can't bear it if they cry. So the thing with dealing with emotion is pretty much the same thing. You'll often see people go in with a box of tissues, trying to hand them a tissue. I think that's such a good idea. What is useful is have some water ready. This is water, by the way. And when you see them starting to get a little bit tearful, just take the water and put it in their hands. Now, don't put it on the table in front of them. That's no good. You put it in their hand. Now, we first discovered this maybe 15 years ago, and we've tested this. I don't know how many organizations now, and then checked with people afterwards. How did it work? What went on? And pretty much every time, this is what happens. If you put water in the hand of somebody who's a little bit tearful, most times they'll just go, and they'll have a little sip. And the moment they start to sip, it's pretty much impossible for them to keep crying. So that, as a tip, which sounds ridiculous, but absolutely works. Put the water in their hands, not in front of them, but in their hands. And then just wait. And most cases, it will work. They will stop. But if not, that's okay. We can talk about that, or we can reschedule, or we can ask them to have a couple of minutes, then we'll pick up again from where we left off. Pallavi, can I ask how committed you are to this? So, a couple of comments on that. First of all, I'm guessing that's a question you might ask somebody who you feel is not willing to take any action. I'm assuming that's your suggestion for that, and you're not asking me personally how committed I am to this. So the observation I'd make about that question is that it's a closed question. Can I ask? Can be answered yes or no. So if I wanted to know how committed somebody was with this, I could go straight to, how committed are you to this? On a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is not at all and 10 is the most, what would your answer be? Now, they're going to say 9 or 10, in which case they're committed. Or they're going to say 7, 6, at which point you're going to say, okay, what would have to change for this to be a 10? Now, you might find that what you're talking about isn't actually what they want to talk about, but they don't know this yet. So you might find this is another version of what have you tried so far? If you don't like 1 to 10, the other thing you could say is, if I could give you this solution that you're talking about right now on a plate, would you take it? Now they should say, yes, yeah, right now, I could do it. But they might say, yeah, I'd do that. In which case it tells you, no, they're not that committed. Hope that helps. Deborah, what about an aggressive individual? What is the best approach? Okay, so I'm going to work on the basis that when you talk about an aggressive individual, we're not at any time talking about any situation where you might be in actual physical danger. Because if you're in actual physical danger, then all bets are off. To kind of leave the room. I'm guessing you might have some protocol around that situation already in your organization. But very often with emotion, you've heard of fight or flight. You know that part of the brain is largely taken over and everything else is being shut out. So reasoning is largely a waste of time. Some people, it tends to be 2 key approaches I've heard people talk about. One is, all right, if you're going to be just ranting, I'll let you rant for a bit. And when you finish ranting, I might then pick up back to where we're going to go with this. Some people say, I'm not having anything to do with it. I shouldn't professionally have to listen to that, put up with that, work with that, so I'm not going to. My view might be, whichever you're most comfortable with is probably the right approach. I'm assuming that if we agree that an aggressive individual at work is not acceptable, then that's where we are. So I'm hoping that answers your questions. I'll just take a moment to see if you have any final further questions. We've gone slightly over the hour. We're just gone past 7 o'clock. So if there are any further questions, that would be tremendous. If there are no further questions, that's also fine. So I will just ask the question What other questions, comments, or observations do you have? I'm going to give you slightly longer than 7 seconds because you have to do the actual typing. Okay, thank you, Pallavi. Thank you, Deborah. Okay, good stuff. So, really appreciate you spending the last hour with us on this webinar. The couple of details for you, just so you know. At the top there, scarab@bluebeetle.co.uk. You can email us there. So if you have any other comments, questions, observations, I would be delighted to do my very best to help you. Down the bottom, if you're into Twitter and tweeting, is our Twitter handle @BlueBeetleTwits. I would really appreciate, as I said to you, this is a new piece of software we've been using. It's a new approach we're using. So if you've enjoyed this webinar, if you found this webinar useful, I'd really appreciate you taking the time just to tweet or message or share on Facebook or whatever it is you do, however it is you do it. I would really appreciate that. But for now, thank you all very, very much. Have a great rest of the evening. And as I say, do contact me if you need any further information. Thank you very much. Good evening.